Welcome to Crafting Your Next Move.
Welcome to Crafting Your Next Move with Lori Kraft, Associate Broker with the Kraft team at Origin Realty Group. Lori is a top-producing Houston Realtor with more than 15 years of experience, helping clients buy and sell homes across the greater Houston area. Known for her honest advice and boutique approach, she and her team combine cutting-edge marketing with good old-fashioned service to deliver results that speak for themselves. I'm Leanne Lyon, and today we're talking about the major industry changes that are making headlines, from DOJ involvement to shifting MLS rules, and what Houston sellers should understand as they prepare to list their home. Hello, Lori. How are you today?
Good. How are you?
This is a deep topic, really relevant right now. So when sellers bring up the national real estate headlines that they've been hearing, how do you help them sort out what's actually relevant to their sale here in Houston?
Well, you have to help them put themselves in the mind of a buyer, because that's where we get people digging their foot in. So just to kind of summarize what happened is we had a period of time where we had sellers brought forth, I think it was in Minnesota was where it started, the argument that they did not know that they had a choice in whether or not they had to pay a buyer's agent fee. And those of us in states like Texas, Florida, California, all raised our eyebrows at that and balked, because it is very clearly stated in our contracts that you can, in fact, you have to fill in the blank as how much you want to pay them. But they were victorious. And so what ended up coming out of that was a firestorm of media coverage that basically said sellers have been getting ripped off for centuries and everyone is overpaying and realtors aren't worth their money and you should negotiate. And it became crazy town. And then, of course, you had a bunch of people on TikTok who were not in the real estate industry. There was one guy that claimed to be a financial analyst, and here's the thing, guys, a lot of that's public record. If you claim to be a financial analyst, I can find out if you're a financial analyst or not. He was not. But he was saying, that you can sell your own home and you don't need a realtor. So there was a lot of misinformation. So what I do is I just clear it up for him. And I say, this is actually what the contract says. And most really good agents will make you go through that contract. A lot of sellers don't want to look at it. Buyers don't want to look at it because it's cumbersome. State of Texas are basic without any addendums. Our form is about 7-8 pages. And that's just the listing agreement. So you go through all of those pages and you make sure they understand it. And what a big piece of that is, what are you going to pay me? And my fee is my fee. I'll negotiate sometimes, but for the most part, I earn my money. I'm going to show you how I earn my money. But the buyer's fee is up to you. And I do get the argument from the seller that, why am I paying somebody to negotiate against my interests? Makes perfect sense to me. The problem is sellers have a tendency to forget that it is far easier to make money than it is to save money. And the seller's making money. The buyer is bringing the money. You don't have any money if you don't have a buyer. There's no money to be had. So if the buyer is having to bring their down payment, all the closing costs, they're having to pay their insurance up front, the taxes, especially this time of year, most of the taxes are buried. That is borne by the buyer. So when you start adding up all this that they have to have in cash up front, seller doesn't bring anything. They might have to do some repairs, but they're not bringing any cash to the table. And then you add on to that 1%, 3%, 7%, whatever the buyer's agent is charging. Then they look at that listing and they go, you know what, I'm out. Let me go to another listing. So you have to help the seller understand not just their own position, but the position of the buyer.
There's been a lot of attention on federal discussions and industry-wide lawsuits. Without getting into legal territory, what should sellers understand about why these issues are in the news?
first of all, I would not get into, I stay in my lane. I'm not going to pretend to be an attorney. And a lot of these are gray areas, right? So basically what's happened is, and we just talked about a little bit on the break, that you have to read your contracts. Don't sign something if you don't understand it. And don't just go, well, it's a lot of paperwork and I'll just, there, go. No, because these are legally binding documents and you have to know what you are signing off on. And we'll talk a little bit about MLS in a minute, but it directly impacts what is advertised. So when, like I said before, when the media got a hold of this, I don't think the media fully understood what the rules and what the fight was about. And it was about transparency. And it's ironic because in our efforts to be more transparent, we've actually made it less transparent. And I'll explain that when you talk about MLS rules. But for the most part, the thing to remember here is you have got to read your contracts. And there is actually, I don't know for any other state, I can only speak to Texas, there's a box that says, are you using an attorney? And who is that attorney? Because even if you're not using an attorney to move the deal forward, you certainly have every reasonable right to ask an attorney to review that document before you sign it. Now, is that attorney going to be able to change it? They can put some things in special provisions, but there are two people on that document, you and your agent. And really, this little guy back here nobody talks about was the broker. The contract is owned by the broker. It is not owned by that agent. So the agent is limited in how much negotiating they can do because they're bound by the rules of the brokerage. So your attorney can look at it and go, well, I want this changed. I want this eradicated and I want this added. And you can add some things in special provision. Your attorney can. I can't. Actually, I could because you're a party to the contract. You can, but it gets complicated, so I wouldn't do it. However, if it's in black, it's promulgated by the state of Texas and their broker lawyer committee. So it is highly unlikely anybody's going to say, yeah, go ahead, change that. They're just not going to do it.
Well, you mentioned MLS earlier, and different MLSs around the country are reviewing their policies. What kind of changes are being discussed in general, and how do you explain that every market, including Houston, may adopt things differently?
Well, first of all, some of it has already been done. It was done back in June of 24. And now there's a whole new discussion that's at play with the MLS, with the national MLSs, with brokerage MLSs. They call them IDX feeds. So on an IDX feed, you have information that's given to the public. We used to be able to put in there what the seller was willing to pay a buyer's agent. But the problem with that is it bound that seller to whatever was put in MLS because the buyer could argue you advertised that you would pay X. So you can't go back and now say you're going to pay Y. And one of the reasons for the lawsuits and the result of the lawsuit was that sellers needed to have the ability to negotiate out those fees. They've always had it, but it wasn't communicated well to them. So at this point, MLS doesn't want to advertise it. In fact, they can't under the regulations of the lawsuit. It needs to be put into the offer, and then the seller can counter and say, no, I'm not paying that. I will pay this. Or if you want to up your offer price, then I'll pay this. And so that it becomes constantly a part of the negotiation. Now, the other thing that's at play with IDX feeds is you have the battle of the behemoths. Right now, we've got our battle of the titans. We have Zillow. We have a Compass. A Compass bought out Anywhere USA. So that's become part of this discussion. The big brokerages like Remax and Keller, Next Home. So what they're trying to figure out is, do we want our own private IDX feed? And then the only people that would have access to it are those people whose agents are a member of that brokerage. Now, if you look at things and how they play, Zillow's MLS IDX feed is like here. The next biggest one, I think, is Realtor.com, and it's here. And then you have Homes.com, and then you have the privates. Now, Compass may be able, with all of their purchasing, may be able to get closer to here, but you see the discrepancy. Zillow is going to be king. Another reason why I think there's a lot of lawsuits against Zillow right now. There is a big push to take them down. There is a real possibility, however, that Zillow will get fed up with all this and say, fine, we'll be our own brokerage. And if that happens, that's going to be a problem for the entire industry. And then you're going to see DOJ suits come to play in terms of, now you've got antitrust violations. So it's going to be a mess for a while. So I'm interested to see what happens with all the MLS and the IDX feeds.
Well, one of the biggest concerns is whether these industry shifts will affect a seller's ability to attract strong buyers. What tends to matter most in keeping a transaction steady, no matter what's happening in the background?
Well, that's kind of a pretty convoluted question there. I'll say when you get listings that go stale, and believe me, in this market, we've definitely had that. You have to do something to redraw that listing. So it's interesting because MLS is very much run by algorithms. So if you change pictures, that can pop the algorithm. If you do a price drop, it changes the algorithm. If you take the property off market for a week and relist it, it will pop it in the algorithm. Now, it won't change your days on market unless it's been off for a year, at least not in Texas. You have to remove it for a full year. Nobody really wants to do that, but the others will work. Adding pictures, changing staging, all of those things will cause it to pop up a little bit in that IDX feed, and then you get new interest. And sometimes if you have a lot that needs to be done, withdraw it for 2 weeks and then make it back active after 2. And why do I say that? Your buyer pool tends to be gone in 2 weeks. So now you're dealing with a new buyer pool.
So what should sellers know about how good communication between agents, lenders, and title partners helps maintain stability while the industry continues adapting?
Well, that is always a critical piece. And I talked about this before in another video about transaction coordinators, so I'll leave that off the table. But I will say that you have an agent that is more or less the commander of the transaction, the general, and they have to keep all the other parties in line because title, if there's attorneys involved, lenders, surveyors, appraisers, all of those people are third parties. They answer to their own people. They don't answer to this agent. They don't answer to the brokerage. They don't answer to anybody but themselves. So you have to make sure everybody's on the same page. There's no questions, no concerns. Somebody goes dark, you better know who to go to up the chain because you can't not hear from somebody for 4 or 5 days. As far as what's going on in the background, it's really not as big of a player right now. Now that may change. But the rules and regulations, titles had to adapt. Agents have had to adapt. Lenders have already got beat up in the mortgage debacle, way back when the savings and loan crash happened. They also got beat up again in 2014 with some of the fraud that happened there. So they're used to pivoting. So lenders have already had to make this shift. So for 2 years, they've all been aware of changes that need to be made. So for the most part, today's industry is pretty on target with that, and they are following the rules. You just got to make sure that your general has command of his troops.
Can you share a time when staying ahead of your industry changes, even smaller local ones, helped you guide a seller through their transaction with more confidence?
Well, sure. At the beginning of this whole thing, there was so much confusion, so much fear. Everybody was convinced they were getting ripped off, right? So you meet with somebody and you go over fees, and that's the first thing everybody wants to know. How much am I going to have to pay for this? And when you help them understand that they have more power and control now than they have ever had in history, it really leaves them feeling a little bit more comfortable. They are going to depend on your expertise to negotiate some of that out. But their fear for most people is that they're going to get a lowball offer and then they're still going to have to pay whatever percentage they thought they were going to have to pay. And what we do is you have to help them see that there's a lot of different creative ways to structure an offer that will still get them the net they want without leaving the buyer feeling ripped off. I had one recently where it was interesting. The buyer came back with 2 options for us, and both stock. We didn't like either one. So what I did is I created 3 options for them. All 3 netted my seller the same amount of money. But it structured it in a way that maybe the seller wasn't having to finance as much, or maybe they were getting more cash up front, or maybe this was going to be more amenable to their lender, and maybe this one might be a little bit more amenable to title. And people like choices, right? They don't be told take it or leave it. Everybody hates that. So when you give a buyer choices, it not only empowers the buyer, it empowers the seller, because the seller's part of that. How do you feel about offering this? What do you feel about offering that?
And as we wrap up here, when you're advising sellers who are hearing a lot of this conflicting information, how do you recommend they keep their expectations grounded in what's actually happening in the Houston market and not what they hear?
Well, and that's very, very hard. So what I tell them is I say, stay off Zillow. Just stay off of it. Not that Zillow's not, I mean, it's a great resource to start when you're looking. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And I certainly don't think it's wrong to see what other people are seeing on Zillow, right? You want to check out your listing on Zillow. You want to make sure it's there. But your news from them is kind of questionable. I also remind them that real estate is hyper local. So if they want to see what Channel 2 News is producing in Houston, then yeah, take a look at that. Then you call me and ask me, and I'll tell you how to filter out what is hype and what is reality. And the biggest thing in the past year has been housing is crashing. Everybody's a fire sale, and totally not true at all. Not true at all. We are just now in January looking at a stable market in Houston. We've been trying to get to a stable market for 20 years. We're stable. Now, come May, it's going to change. So hold your hats, people.
Well, especially in such a massive market such as Houston, things can change.
Absolutely.
Suburb to suburb to inner.
And they change overnight. It's crazy.
Yeah.
That's fun. That's why I do what I do.
Exactly. Well, that is it for today's episode of Crafting Your Next Move. If you're thinking about selling in Cypress, Tomball, Memorial Villages, Inner Loop, or anywhere in the greater Houston area, visit craftrealtyteam.com to learn more or connect directly with Lori's team. And remember to like, subscribe, and leave a review if you found this episode helpful.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.